Our speaker today, no stranger to this place, Bruce Mainzer. He's been here several times before, and he always has very interesting information to share with us, today being no exception. He's the former co-chair of the Chicago chapter of the Climate Reality Project, also a member of the EV transportation team. After getting a master's degree in transportation from Northwestern, Bruce worked for 10 years in public transportation, including stints with the RTA, Illinois DOT, and Metro North Commuter Railroad in New York City. Bruce retired in 2019 after serving for the last 13 years of his career as a marketing and pricing consultant for hotel owners and major travel industry brands. So please welcome Bruce Mainzer.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Bob, my neighbor, for bringing me here today. It's always enjoyable. And thank you to Jill for her help in setting this up. I'm here to talk about climate. It's a very difficult period right now for people who are active in the climate, but in trying to find solutions. Today's topic is about the fossil fuel interests and climate denial. So what we're going to do is first talk about the science. What's the reason for the way the world is warming, the impact to us in terms of the costs and the problems that we're having with major disasters, a forecast of what's likely to happen if we don't take action, and then I'll discuss the disinfo problem and some solutions that we can take, even though right now our federal government is not interested in taking any solutions. The Climate Reality Project was founded by Al Gore, and it's a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness and building a global movement for climate action. And it trains and mobilizes individuals to advocate for policies and solutions that address the climate crisis. And our mission is to catalyze the global solutions for urgent action on climate change. Every chapter of the organization is dedicated to working to build a just and sustainable net zero future. Our goals are to reduce global emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And we do this by 4 key areas: reducing emissions, calling out greenwashing, financing a just transition, and strengthening international cooperation on climate. Now, the Chicago Metro chapter was one of the first in the country, established in 2017, so I'm a proud member of that. We are one of the largest chapters in climate reality. Our recent successes, including getting a commitment from Pace Suburban Bus to operate an entirely battery electric bus fleet by 2040, and to halt all further purchases of fossil fuel buses. And we are leading the efforts to get the city of Chicago to file a lawsuit against big oil, which is damaging our environment, Chicago's environment. So let's get a little bit to the science. I've used this slide before, but just to go over to repeat, what's the reason that we call this the greenhouse effect? Basically, the sun's radiation is received by the earth, and we have a thin layer of atmosphere which acts to retain some of the heat, which is a good thing because then we'd be ice cold like Mars or Venus or whatever. But the problem is that since the Industrial Revolution, we've been adding to this CO2 in the upper atmosphere, and it's keeping too much of the radiation, too much of the warmth into the in Earth. So it's similar to a greenhouse where, when you see a greenhouse, and to regulate the heat, some of the windows up above are open, so some of the heat can leave, so it doesn't turn into, an oven. Well, what's happening right now is that as we add CO2 to the atmosphere, it's basically shutting off the ability for radiation to leave the Earth. So One of the first people to warn us of the dangers of too much climate was James Hansen, who in 1988 briefed Congress on what was likely going to happen if we didn't stop spewing greenhouse gases into the upper atmosphere. And he was one of the first to help raise broad awareness of this problem. And I like the way he put it here. We're treating the skies like an open sewer. And this is his quote, and this is really an incredible concept if you think about it. The amount of energy that is being retained by Earth is equivalent to 600,000 first-generation atomic bombs per day, 365 days per year. I just read yesterday that Paris reached a temperature of 104 degrees. So it's continuing to be a huge problem. So if we're going to address how to attack the emission problem, we need to understand the big picture. And this gives us the picture. And oh, there it goes. This is a pie chart of where emissions are coming from in the US. And the largest area is transportation. This is primarily for the US. And these are largely emissions produced by each of us as individuals driving our passenger cars and light-duty trucks. Close to 60% of the transportation sector pie slice is from our personal cars and our personal light-duty trucks. Not commercial, not government, it's the cars we drive. And then if you look at the electricity pie slice, 70% is also due to us as individuals because this is the amount of electricity required by residences. And then finally, if you look at the emissions coming from buildings, mostly gas furnaces, that's to heat our homes. So if you look at that, we are, in our individual lives are playing a significant role, and I'll get back to that towards the end of this presentation. Now, carbon dioxide is the key and most dominant, as the other charts are for parts per billion. The CO2 is parts per million. And so right now we're at over 420 parts per million. In carbon dioxide can stay in our atmosphere for more than 100 years. So, and about 20% of the CO2 in the upper atmosphere has been there for 1,000 years. Methane and natural gas in the short term, they last for about 20 years. Problem is methane, which is a byproduct of natural gas, we really should call it methane gas, is over 80 times more heat trapping per molecule than CO2. Because that molecule, if you've ever seen the chemical formulation for methane, it's a really huge molecule. Nitrous oxide is from agriculture, soil disturbance, and also from forest fires. So this chart shows total global greenhouse gas emissions from 1850 to 2023, measured in carbon dioxide equivalents, which includes not only CO2, but also methane and nitrous oxide. Emissions, as you can see, have risen dramatically from under 5 billion tons in the early 1900s to over 53.8 billion metric tons today. The rise became especially steep after the 1950s, aligning with rapid industrialization and global economic growth. This period is often referred to as the Great Acceleration in environmental science. When we break it down by region, China, if you look, is now the #1 emitter, responsible for the largest share of emissions. United States is #2, although it has a longer history of emissions, making it the biggest historical contributor to atmospheric CO2. India and other parts of Asia are rising quickly, and regions like Africa, South America, and Oceania contribute relatively less. But these are the regions that are more susceptible to climate change. So this slide illustrates the cumulative buildup of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel emissions since 1750. So this is the cumulative, not the actual what's happening in each year. And a key takeaway here is that CO2, as I mentioned, stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, meaning what we're pouring into the skies right now have long-term consequences. Now, on the right, the chart shows how dramatically emissions have increased, especially since the mid-20th century. As I mentioned before, the US is the largest historical emitter, responsible for over 431 billion metric tons, followed by the European Union and China. And together, these top three contributors account for a significant share of the cumulative total, over 1.2 trillion metric tons of CO2. Now, these figures highlight the need for global accountability and action, especially amongst the biggest, polluters. Now, one of the interesting things is you notice in the 1850s, you notice the line at the bottom, the United Kingdom in blue. So that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England, powered by coal. And then you see the US take over in largely the second half of the 20th century. And you can see China's breathtaking rise only since about 1975 or 1980. So this is, to me, this is a very fascinating way to look at how the world has developed. This bathtub visual shows how emissions are pouring into the atmosphere much faster than they can be removed. So the point is that when the Earth was created, you had emissions, you had CO2 in the atmosphere, which is necessary to keep the Earth warm. But what's happened, and net removals are primarily the oceans and the forests and wetlands to absorb the CO2. But we've added this additional faucet, human emissions, and that's creating there's not enough net removals to really bring down the CO2 in the atmosphere. So this is a very scary slide. This is the latest CO2 reading, and it goes back approximately 1 million years, and you can see where we've been in terms of CO2 in the atmosphere. And all that impact, actually, it was a black line off to the far right, where it suddenly took off to where we're, 3 times higher, or more than 2 times higher. And it's all been in the last 50 years. And it's a very scary slide. So another way to look at it is what we are doing in terms of getting rid of greenhouse gases. And we have our natural sinks, which is responsible for removing 7.6 gigatons a year. These are the forests, the wetlands and the grasses and whatever. Our emissions are 11.1 per year, primarily because of the increased activity of humans. So we're adding to the atmosphere 3.5 gigatons a year. So the loss of natural, and the additional problem here is we're losing Earth's remaining wilderness, like forests, wetlands, and natural landscapes. They've been shrinking over time alongside rising CO2 levels and population growth. So look at this. In 1937, about 67% of Earth's wilderness was still intact. This means that the world had already lost 1/3 of its natural carbon sinks even before the industrial emissions really took off. Fast forward to now, 2024, and we're down to just 19% of wilderness remaining. That's a dramatic loss, over 2/3. So this matters because forests and wetlands act like the lungs of the earth, absorbing carbon dioxide and helping regulate the climate. So as we lose these carbon sinks, it becomes harder to balance the increased emissions we're producing. So as the world's excess heat is also going into the world's oceans, and that explains a lot of the weather patterns we're seeing, all the way down to 2,000 meters and below. But the astonishing fact about this is that half of it has been occupying in the last 20 years. So that line that you see, the vertical line, that's in the last 20 years. And so this is creating more, the heat that's building up in the ocean is creating more intense hurricanes, as hurricanes draw their energy from warm water, and warmer air holds more moisture. The warmer oceans are causing massive shifts in weather patterns and influence the El Nino cycles. These changes can lead to prolonged droughts in some areas, extreme cold snaps in others, and tornadoes and other severe storms, which we're seeing plenty of evidence today. And then finally, melting Arctic ice is leading to melt glaciers, contributing to sea level rise, leading to more destructive storm surges. So a little bit about the human costs. I don't have, all you have to do is pick up a newspaper and see what's going on. I think everybody recognizes the floods that occurred in North Carolina that I don't know if anybody's been there recently, but I think they're still trying to recover from that horrible situation. Hurricane and tornado damage in Fort Pierce, Florida. You know, Florida always has had hurricanes. Now they're getting a lot more. But only in the last 20 years are they starting to get tornadoes. Tornadoes were unheard of in Florida, but now they're experiencing that. Of course, this is the Wrightwood, California fire, but that was more than overtaken by the massive fire in Los Angeles, which was sparked by 100-mile-per-hour winds. We're all familiar with smoke. I think today's a smoke advisory day, possibly, but we're going to continue to see this during the summer. I get mad because I can't play golf when it's this bad out. This slide shows a dramatic increase in the billion-dollar climate and weather disasters in the U.S. from 1980 to 2024. So events like severe storms, tropical cyclones, wildfires, and floods have grown significantly in both frequency and cost, rising about 3 times since 1980. Costs are now regularly topping $300 to $500 billion annually, and we're all paying for this in our insurance. The right side of the slide highlights broader risks, a potential $38 trillion cost by 2050, which would represent an 18% loss in our GDP and a 50% loss in species. So we're in the middle of the worst impacts of climate change. Now, last year, 20 million people were displaced from the areas they've always called home by climate-related extremes. And over the past 25 years, climate-related migration has played a growing role in conflict, instability, and humanitarian crises worldwide. I can mention the major ones here. How many people know that the Syrian civil war that started in 2006 really was brought on by climate change? A drought devastated agriculture, forcing over 1.5 million people into cities, and the government inaction helped ignite the Syrian civil war in 2011. And over 13 million were displaced. And of course, that led to major political consequences across Europe, the 2015 migrant crisis, and the resultant rise of right-wing populism. And the war itself cost over 500,000 lives. And then you have Central America, climate stress, crop failure, which has led to gangs in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and repeated droughts and floods have ruined harvests And so this has led to people surging into the US as asylum seekers, and that's obviously led to our political instability here. So these crises show that those least responsible for climate change often bear the heaviest burdens. And as climate change accelerates, mass displacement is expected to increase dramatically, with up to 216 million people projected to become climate migrants by 2050. So just one slide on where we are in this climate problem. In terms of global and greenhouse gases, if we want to keep climate change within safer limits, the red line here shows total global emissions since 1970. So today, we're emitting over 53 gigatons of CO2 equivalent gases per year, nearly double what we were in 1970. The green area represents, at the bottom, represents carbon removal efforts like reforestation, soil, carbon storage, and emerging technologies such as direct air capture. These are just starting to scale up, but in my opinion, it's never going to be enough to overcome the increased emissions that we're contributing. The blue shaded region shows what happens if we continue on our current path. Global temperatures could rise by 2.5 degrees centigrade or 3.5 degrees centigrade, pushing us into even more extreme climate impacts, rising sea levels, severe droughts, and widespread species loss. So to stay within the 1.5 centigrade limit, the target set by the Paris Agreement, we need to cut emissions nearly by half by 2030 and return to about 1970 level emissions by 2050. So this shows the daunting task that we have, where we are and where we need to be. So with all these problems, now we've entered into the age of advanced disinformation that has been created about the climate crisis. And so it's always been with us for a long time. In 1977, a senior Exxon scientist, James Black, gave a presentation to Exxon's top executives stating that burning fossil fuels was increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and would lead to significant global warming. He warned that man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical. In the early 1980s, Exxon's own scientists confirmed the mainstream climate science that fossil fuel combustion would raise global temperatures and cause potentially serious environmental impacts. And in fact, in 1982, Exxon produced an internal report with detailed projections of future CO2 levels and temperature increases, showing a clear understanding between the link between fossil fuel use and climate change. These early findings were kept internal or shared only with select audiences, and in subsequent decades, Exxon shifted to casting doubt on climate science publicly, despite the clarity of its internal research. Their statements casting doubt has been continuing through today. So it really started in the 80s. In the 90s, there's that statement, there's a lot we really don't know about how climate change works. So this is coming from the company that actually employed scientists that showed exactly what was going to happen. And still that company issued statements saying the science is in doubt. So this has always been a key strategy for the industry. The most recent statement was in 2024, saying getting to net zero will cost too much money. So historians remind us that the science behind climate has been clear for decades, long before it became politically controversial. As early as 1958, scientists knew that burning fuels released carbon dioxide. By the 1960s, US government scientists were warning elected officials that continued fossil fuel could alter Earth's climate. Uh, the, um, but instead of leading to bold action, this growing consensus was met with resistance, not because of flawed science, but due to a deliberate disinformation campaign funded by fossil fuel interests. These companies mimicked big tobacco's strategy, casting doubt on the science, lobbying against regulations, and promoting climate denial in the media and politics. Now, scientists and legal advocates are turning to archival documents and modern event attribution science to expose the history of deception and hold polluters accountable. The evidence is clear. Elected officials have known the risks of fossil fuels for over 60 years, and the delay in action has not been due to lack of knowledge, but lack of political will, fueled by disinformation. Of course, well before this year, we've had the fossil fuel industry definitely implement a massive strategy to keep us relaxed about the climate. This article in The Guardian from 2024, I think very well captures the messaging strategies of the fossil fuel industry. So they usually do it under a number of points. One is energy security. The fossil fuel industry loves to trumpet its role in keeping the world safe, even when it is engaging in pursuing more drilling and more fossil fuel burning, which makes us less secure. The fact is that the US military, the previous administration's US military, lists climate change and continuing to burn fossil fuel as the major threat to world peace. Next point is the economy versus the environment. The fossil fuel industry has hammered this theme repeatedly for decades, that taking care of the environment is bad for the economy, saying that it would just be way too expensive to act on climate, and that in any case, climate change was not going to be a big deal. So the best thing would be to do nothing, and just emphasize that the third bullet point, we make your life work. The fossil fuel industry loves to argue that it makes the world work, from keeping the lights on to keeping us riveted by smartphones and TV and clothed in fast fashion. Then we're part of the solution. A lot of the advertising I am seeing is that the oil companies are actively working on solutions, when in reality, they are spending just a pittance on real solutions and continuing to drill and expand their fossil fuel capacities. Look at BP, British Petroleum, they changed their logo to be all green. They run ads to how environmentally conscious they are. But if you look at their annual report, they spend less than 1% of their revenues, of their expenses on green solutions. And finally, the world's greatest neighbor. Just in case people still aren't accepting the dirty air, dirty water, and climate change, the fossil fuel industry funds museums, sports, aquariums, and schools, serving the dual purpose of cleaning up its image. But as I mentioned before, thanks to Chicago chapter members, we worked along with other groups in Chicago to file lawsuits against the oil companies, and Climate Reality is actively in the fight to hold these companies accountable. So many people have remarked that this campaign has been extremely effective. It reminds me of the tobacco campaign, where for many years the tobacco companies put out information or lack of information that the science was in doubt. Same kind of thing. And this expert, Ben Franta from Stanford Law School, says this is deceptive but incredibly successful, to put the blame on people to ensure that nothing changes. So we need to stop the policies that give them an incentive to continue. And my belief is we can change. So one of the areas that I'm most interested in is vehicles and electric vehicles. And I have to tell you that I believe that the US car manufacturers have really fallen down in implementing the new technology of EVs. Basically, what happened was Tesla introduced models that were oriented to the luxury price point, and American car manufacturers, who are always interested in maximizing their price, their profitability per vehicle, said, we're going to copy Tesla at that very high price point. Problem is, Tesla basically saturated and got the entire market of those luxury luxury buyers. So a more logical strategy should have been to do what China is doing with their models, introduce affordable EVs. And so, but we ended up with an initial set of models that were priced way too high and didn't really capture the public's imagination. One of the worst examples was Chevy happened to have one vehicle called the Chevy Bolt, which was very affordable, and Mary Barra, GM's CEO, killed the car, and it caused such a reaction that she's been forced to bring it back, but it won't be back till 2027. Similarly, Ford has recognized their mistake in only producing very high-end EVs, so they're in development now for a much lower cost EVs. You know, and I mentioned it here. So I think the future is good. I think they're now starting to realize that they need to create affordable cars. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for them to retool their plants to get the right kind of vehicles here. And now we have, in the current administration, our own federal government becoming number one in spreading disinfo. We have the fellow who's the U.S. Energy Secretary, who's a former fracking executive, stating that there's no climate crisis and we're not in the midst of an energy transition. We have the social media posts from Donald J. Trump, who basically blames Democrats for any fires that come up instead of blaming the true scientific reasons. And we have one of the problems we have with climate reality is much of the data that we use for research has been cataloged on U.S. government websites, and they're all those pages have been erased. And that's been a big problem. The same thing happened in the first term, and this second term, they've done an even better job of removing all that information. So this slide illustrates the true costs of fossil fuels by showing both direct and indirect subsidies as reported by the International Monetary Fund. The chart compares 5 fuel types: kerosene, oil, electricity, natural gas, and coal, and shows that indirect subsidies, represented in green, far outweigh direct subsidies, shown in blue. Coal receives the highest total subsidies, nearing $2.2 trillion annually, following by natural gas and oil. And these indirect subsidies account for hidden costs such as environmental damage, health impacts, climate change consequences, and the data underscores how heavily fossil fuels are supported by governments worldwide, distorting energy markets and making it harder for clean energy to compete. In 2024, the U.S. government provided fossil fuel industry with an estimated $757 billion in subsidies, including both direct and indirect. And around $20 billion was direct, like tax savings for drilling and whatever, while the remaining $754 billion was considered implicit, such as the costs of negative health impacts, and environmental degradation that we have to pay for, that the oil companies don't have to pay for. So the International Monetary Fund did a calculation of what would happen if, and you always hear climate deniers saying, I don't want my tax money going into green energy sources, as if the green energy sources are receiving the subsidies. That's projection. Actually, the fossil fuel industry is receiving massive subsidies worldwide from governments all over the world. And so the International Monetary Fund just came up with these calculations of how many millions of lives would be saved per year, how much government revenues would rise because of the tax savings, how many emissions would fall 34%, and the redistribution of income subsidies. So I'll just spend a little bit of time on solutions. I've given presentations before, but there are so many solutions that we can all take in our daily lives. And I'm sure some of you are doing this, and that's to be applauded. But I like to concentrate on what we can do as individuals, and especially in the powering our vehicles and heat and power our buildings. There are better ways to manage agriculture and generate power, which we can get into in questions later. But I wanted to repeat the slide I provided at the beginning of section, and I wanted to again highlight for us that in the United States, we as individuals, the largest area is transportation, and these are emissions produced by each of us as individuals. And as I mentioned before, close to 60% of the transportation pie slice is from our personal cars. I mentioned before, 70% of that green pie slice, which is electricity emissions, is for our homes, and more than half is from our residential and commercial buildings, largely our gas and oil furnaces. So this is a quote from the head of Rewiring America, which is a wonderful organization. I encourage you to Google search Rewiring America. They have guides on how you can lower your carbon footprint. And if you take those percentages of the pie slices I just mentioned, 70% of electricity, 60% of transportation, et cetera, you come up with a calculation that 42% of the emissions coming from the United States are emissions coming from our personal decisions as to what kind of car we drive, how we heat our homes, what kind of electrical appliances we have. So he says simply switching everything in our lives to be powered by electricity from renewable energy will go a long way towards getting our emissions down and reducing the impact of climate change. So I always talk to my son. My son said, corporate America has to change. And I said, no, we have the ability, if we all do this, we can significantly lower our percentage, the percentage of greenhouse gases. So the key to this is electrification. And how does electrification address the problem of emissions? Some may believe that our electricity is all powered by fossil fuels right now, which is not true. Right now, the grid that most of us are on is this called the grid, the RFCW grid, if you can see that, which is Indiana, Ohio, and just the Chicago area going up to Milwaukee. That grid right now is about average in the US, and 63% of the electricity on that grid is powered by coal, oil, and gas. Not good news. But the remainder right now is powered by nuclear power, which doesn't have carbon emissions. I'm not a fan of nuclear power, but at least it doesn't have carbon emissions. And renewable energy sources of wind and solar. Now, over time, every grid, including our RFCW grid, will be improving as more wind and solar projects come online. I'm sure we've all driven on the interstates in Indiana and central Illinois and seen those impressive wind turbines, and more of those are being built all the time. But I wanted to make another point here. Even if the electric grid was powered 100% by fossil fuels like coal and gas, which is not, but even it was, using electricity would still yield benefits to reduce emissions. Why? Because there is tremendous inefficiency in each of us having our own fossil fuel machines emitting to power our car and our household appliances. Now, as an example, a gasoline-powered car wastes 2/3 of its emissions on unusable excess heat. Might be okay in the winter when you need the heat, but most of the time, that's a waste. While an electric car utilizes 80% of the energy to directly propel the car. So even in a hypothetical scenario where every bit of electricity for an electric car is sourced from a coal power plant, that car would still be better for the environment than a gasoline car, especially with respect to all the other pollutants like nitrogen oxide and benzene. So that's why clean energy made up 87% of all the new electricity generating capacity worldwide last year. Now, global electricity demand has been increasing rapidly in recent years, and now with these quantum data facilities, which are huge hogs for electricity, I don't know if we'll be able to keep up with this. In fact, I believe Facebook or Google is interested now in building more nuclear plants to fuel their quantum computers. But to meet this growing demand, we have to get renewable energy sources to play a significant role. In 2023, fossil fuels comprised 82% of global primary energy, while renewables accounted for 15%. That is still far from what we need to do to curb global warming. Now, so we've also gotten the view that people are spreading disinformation that green energy is more expensive. It's the opposite. Fossil fuel energy is more expensive. So this is a continuation of the projection by the fossil fuel interests to keep their business going. So this is the levelized cost of electricity, the average cost of currency per unit. And wind and solar are now among the cheapest sources of electricity all over the world. The cost of utility scale solar has dropped by over 80% since 2010, and onshore wind by 70%. And it's much cheaper now than running coal or gas plants. So why isn't the grid already mostly renewable? Here are the main reasons. And yes, the resistance from legacy fossil fuel interests is part of the story. Fuel infrastructure like power plants, pipelines, refineries is capital intensive and long lived, often designed to operate for 30 to 50 years. These assets represent billions in sunk investments, and fossil fuel companies naturally are doing as much as they can to keep them from retiring. The second area is grid design and reliability. Today's electrical grids were originally designed for centralized power from predictable sources like coal, gas, or nuclear. Solar and wind are variable and decentralized, requiring major upgrades in transmission lines, grid storage, smart grid tech, and these upgrades take time, money, and coordination across governments and utilities. We have a particular problem here in Illinois. ComEd, along with the manager of the grid, a semi-public company called PJM, has been very resistant to making the improvements necessary to get more renewables on. And then I've always mentioned the third reason is in many countries, fossil fuels still receive significant subsidies, so they want to keep that going. And finally, fossil fuel companies have historically lobbied heavily to slow or block clean energy transitions to block their business, to protect their business models. So I've shown this graph before. I just want you to imagine that the average household in the United States emits 20 to 30 metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. So a metric ton is about the size of a two-story home, a cube 28 by 28 by 28 feet. So we as individuals are emitting about 40% of the total emissions in the US, or that's 2.4 billion metric tons just by households. So that I want you to keep that visualization. But we can do a lot to change this, and I've shown this slide before. Basically, the blue bar is what metric tons are for the average household. If you switch to a electric vehicle, you can bring it down. Each electric vehicle can save you 3 metric tons. Installing rooftop solar panels would get your emissions almost down to 0 for a household. An electric water heater can save about 1 metric ton, and using a heat pump instead of a gas furnace can lower it by over 3 metric tons. So you could take a household just by making these changes and get down to almost half the emissions just by going in this direction. As far as EVs are concerned, I'm a big fan of my EV. And one of the things I wanted to say is many people here drive hybrids. Hybrids are good, but if you drive a hybrid, you still are paying for another propulsion system, an internal combustion engine. So you're paying a lot more for that car than if you would just have an electric vehicle. Electric vehicles are much more reliable. But the other thing about this is that as you go into the grid and use the grid, my car will improve over time in terms of emissions because I know the grid's improving. As more solar and wind come on, my car becomes even more efficient without me doing anything. Whereas if you're driving a hybrid, you're still dependent on gas and oil. So many people are upset with the EV tax credits going away. I don't think it's such a problem because I think you're going to see EVs, the price of an EV purchase price is going to come down equal to internal combustion engine cars. But even in this analysis, the total cost of ownership for a car like the VW ID4 is already lower with the federal incentive. Without the federal incentive, it's the same. But I think you're going to see this go even lower in the future as Ford and Chevy and even Stellantis come out with lower cost cars. If we had Chinese cars, the most popular Chinese car, I think, is only about a EV is only about $15,000 right now. So one of the reasons that the U.S. is failing with respect to EVs is because of the missteps taken in introducing EVs in this country. Here are the countries where, as percentage of sales, the top EV countries. Look at the top 3 or 4 countries, and then what's interesting about that to you guys? They're cold climates. And what's the criticism of EVs? Oh, the range is too low in a cold climate. Well, people in Norway and Iceland certainly don't believe that. So, which maybe the fossil fuel companies would say, well, we're warming the earth enough so that you can drive it. Last thing is I just mentioned heat pumps. Heat pumps move heat from inside the home using a refrigerant to outside. So it's just like your refrigerator. You know, if you put your hand over the fan coming out of you're getting a lot of heat because, and so it's the same. You use a refrigerant like Freon. I don't know if Freon's legal anymore, but whatever the refrigerant, to basically compress or expand it to move heat either in the house or move it out of the house. So the process can be reversed. The heat pump can also serve as your air conditioner because the process can be reversed in the summer to cool your home. So, so this shows the process of how it can be work in the winter and summer. And this is a major way to bring down your carbon emissions. The heat pump water heater works on the same way, and it's really a superior technology to using a gas furnace underneath. When you think about it, why do we use that? I mean, if we can keep our food cold with a refrigerant and you reverse the process to warm up water, why not use that instead of burning all this unnecessary CO2 to keep our water warm? So we have come up with an electrification pledge for the chapter, which we encourage people to come to our website, which is climaterealitychicago.com. And you can take this pledge, and we give you resources to basically plan out how you can convert your home to have using a heat pump, getting an electric vehicle, and doing all the major things that can bring down your emissions. And also, I think that going to the Rewiring America site is also very helpful. So we have this on our website, Pledge to Electrify. And I'll just end it by saying, you know, the bottom line is I tend to look at this simply. The future of the earth, the future of mankind is based on we need to stop burning fossil fuels. There are plenty of solutions out there. If you just carry that thought with you every day, question why you need to buy a new appliance that is involved with burning fossil fuel, we'll all be much better off. So thank you for the time, and I'm free to take questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Wonderful presentation. Arnie will take questions from the auditorium.
I wonder how many climate denier groups have you given this presentation to? And can you give any of this presentation to any groups in the administration, or do you just give the presentation to those who already believe?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've not been successful in getting in front of a climate denial group. I will say that it's very regionally based. So I just came back from a trip to Yellowstone National Park, and we stopped at a natural history museum, the Buffalo Bill Natural History Museum in Cody, Wyoming. And I went through it, which is a science-based natural history museum, and there was not one panel that mentioned climate change or fossil fuel burning, but there was a lot of displays on how Wyoming's fossil fuel, coal, gas is so important for America's energy independence. And I was just so saddened because, you know, a museum is where you educate children. And we're here in the United States, and we still regionally are very selective in who really is getting the proper knowledge. And of course, you have the private sector actively undermining climate education. So it's I don't want you to get too depressed, but it's depressing.
Yeah, I read an article the other day, which stunned me. Instead of worry about climate change affecting the atmosphere, they were talking about the heat, and they said the sun, the heat is melting the snow in the Arctic and in Greenland 3 million tons a day. And they then did a detailed analysis of how this is going to affect the shoreline of all the people living on the oceans in the United States, in the world, and how many people are going to be out of homes and in trouble.
Yeah.
From what you said, would you say that the Tesla is on the right track in terms of clean air?
The Tesla?
The Teslas?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're electric vehicles.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
How about Rivian? From Illinois?
Rivian, the most impressive thing about Rivian, I think, are their delivery trucks that now they're building for Amazon. They are incredible vehicles, and they're doing a lot to dispel the idea that EVs aren't ready for trucks, or the range is not suitable. You're not hearing Amazon complain about that at all. In fact, one of the worst things that happened under this administration or under the previous Trump administration is that EVs are perfect for postal vehicles because they're not driven. You're not going to have a postal vehicle that's run for more than 150 miles a day. So it's perfect for EVs. And yet I forgot the name of the former postmaster, but he went out and signed a contract for thousands of gasoline powered postal vehicles.
I have a Nissan Leaf. I bought it 5 years ago. I spend $10 a month charging it. That's what it cost me, $10 a month. I've had absolutely no maintenance problems, period, none, zero. And if for some reason I wanted to get a different car, I'd get the same car again.
Right.
I fit in the back of that Nissan Leaf 2 patio chairs. Sort of seat to seat, but it fit. I just roll down the seats and fits the patio chairs in there. It costs so little for me to have that car. It's
Right.
and it's a Nissan Leaf.
Right. And electric vehicles have, an internal combustion engine has thousands and thousands of moving parts. An electric vehicle barely has any moving parts. So people don't believe it. There's no maintenance. There's no oil change. I've been driving an electric vehicle for six or 8 years. The only maintenance I've had are the tires. That's it.
Bruce, we have a question. We have comments from Mike Goldstein on Zoom. First of all, he's supporting what you were saying about how many affordable EVs there are in Europe, particularly the Scandinavian countries. And he mentions how he and his wife use an electric motor scooter about the size of a Vespa to do their shopping, and they can make a difference that way. I have a question that relates to our political divide. It's not as much political as it is an opportunity. I lead discussion groups where clearly there's a big divide between Democrats and I would call it MAGA Republicans. And that divide almost balances out each other. One is very, very anti, one is very, very pro. But within our political climate, America has got three groups. It has the Republican versus Democrats that we see in the news all the time. But the biggest voting group in America are independents. Do you have any feeling on how independents are feeling about this issue and how you're reaching them?
Right. I believe I'm hopeful because of things like the cost of energy, from renewables being lower, EVs going lower. I think what independents, will do is that when it becomes clear that it's cheaper to operate an electric vehicle, just based on the economics, you're going to see massive movement. And you're seeing this in China right now. Nobody wants to buy an internal combustion engine car in China, so that's why it's taking off there. So I think we'll get there, but it's more about just the straight economics. I will admit that I started driving my EV because I was concerned about the climate. Independents aren't going to do that, but if the economics are there, they'll convince.
And they are probably the most influential group in America right now, and they're underrepresented.
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that was a very clear presentation. It was very good. My question is, at one point, you mentioned the replacement of people where there was drought and terrible conditions. Where are those people going?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think what we're experiencing on the southern border is very similar to what Europe experienced and is continuing to experience with people fleeing from Africa, making the perilous journey across the Mediterranean. The Syrian, huge millions of people left Syria, and that was all climate related. And then you had dictators and politicians like Putin seeing it as a way of destabilizing Western liberal democracies. So what's happening right now is the world is suffering impacts from continuing to put these people in peril and them being forced to leave because there's no way for them to farm, droughts, heat, and gangs take over. There's starvation. So that's why they're flooding, coming north. They're not Mexicans. It's the countries around the equator that are really suffering. So,
is there some kind of estimate as to how much fossil fuels are needed to provide electric to the people for cars and things like that?
well, I mean, the issue right now, the grid we're on is 65% fossil fuels, but we want to get that down.
I mean, it costs. How much if it costs, you're still going to have fossil fuel to produce the electric.
Right, but more and more of the electricity over time. I mean, the goal is by 2050 to have only renewables be the source of electrical power. So we want to see fossil fuels go down.
Is that cheaper?
Yes, yeah, it'll definitely cheaper. Sure. And one of the things that are going on, we are suffering under past issues of energy insecurity. So for example, ethanol. Ethanol is probably the most wasteful way you can produce gasoline, because you have to use so many emissions to plant, and that causes the soil to, the way the soil is tilled contributes to carbon emissions. Then the gasoline that's used to, farm and to carry the corn and whatever. And it is an expensive way to create electricity. But politically, there are farmers here who, in Illinois and other states, that their livelihood depends on creating ethanol, growing corn for ethanol, and then mixing it with gasoline in our cars. And it's totally wasteful. But politically, we can't get rid of it, because even our Governor Pritzker, who is an advocate for clean energy, can't politically have the will to say, I don't want any more ethanol. So.
Okay, Bruce, thanks so much for the presentation.
Okay, good.
We're going to wrap it up.